Welcome to this rebroadcast of Voting is Power Unleashed. Thank you for joining us for this important online event in these dark and dangerous days. Indeed, we are living in a time of crisis, in a nation where there are 140 million people who are poor or won fire, healthcare crisis, job loss, emergency, storm away from deep poverty. More than 200,000 people dead from the novel coronavirus because of the misleadership of our elected officials. A nation where 1,000 people are killed every year by the police, those who vow to protect and serve. Where there are 64 million workers now being called essential, but still being paid expendable wages, and nearly 100 million people without health care in the worst public health crisis in over a century, with tens of millions more facing losing their health care because of tax on the ACA. There is record job loss. 1 in 10 low-income renters are likely to face eviction in the next 2 months. The world is on fire, and storms and climate chaos are destroying lives and livelihoods. 13 million people reported not having enough to eat in August, in a nation that throws away more food than it takes to feed the entire world. And last month, 1 in 10 people reported being depressed and suicidal because the injustice is just too much. It's too hard. There are political, economic, and religious authorities, powers and principalities who are hurting the people, shortening their lives, allowing for unneeded death. And although billionaires have made $845 billion in the midst of this pandemic, and the Federal Reserve has materialized trillions to bail out Wall Street, the Senate and the President have not passed a stimulus package, letting hundreds of millions of people to fend for ourselves. Our governing authorities have failed to get this virus under control and are allowing unprecedented hunger, poverty, misery, and evictions to grow. But this is where a movement comes in. This is where you come in. Poor and low-income people hold the key to changing our entire political landscape and making poverty and racism history. When poor and low-income people organize and vote around an agenda of healthcare and living wages, quality education, and true immigration and police reform, an agenda that calls for a just taxation system, the demilitarization of our communities, we have the power to win these demands and win them all. There is still time to do more, to mobilize and organize, register and educate people for a movement that votes. Go to poorpeoplescampaign.org/voting to join phone banks, to text and call voters to participate in this election. Become a poll monitor. Protect our voting rights. Take the prophetic pledge. Encourage hundreds, thousands of people in our communities to turn out, to raise our voices, and to vote. We need you to heed history's call to throw down, to save the soul of our democracy, and to fight for a livable future. We have the power to be the change we need to see in our nation, and we will move forward together, not one step back.
Tonight, as we rebroadcast Unleashing the Power of the Vote from September the 14th, I wanted to come on and you not see my face, but hear my voice. And as my grandfather used to say, I want to turn your ears into eyes, and I want you to see what I believe is possible to see in the midst of all of the turmoil. I'm not the first to see it. In fact, It was Langston Hughes that was first to see it in the midst of the turmoil and the struggle and the riots of 1935. And then and there, he said, "Oh, let America be America again. The land that never has been yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free. The land that's mine's, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me. Who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain. We must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again. America. Oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the wreck and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. This year, unleashing the power of the vote of poor and low wealth people and their allies and moral leaders is in a sense swearing an oath that America may never have been fully America to some of us, but America will be. It is swearing an oath. That is why thousands are calling millions with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and knocking on doors and making preparations and plans. Poor and low wealth people represent over 30% of the electorate now in this country. We have power. 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 And it's time for a rising. A rising that says we will be a country that eradicates systemic racism in every manifestation against black, brown, and indigenous people rather than embrace racism. We will be a country that will alleviate poverty rather than entrench poverty. We need a rising that says we will be a country that ensures health care for all rather than eviscerate it. We will be a country that envisions saving the environment rather than ensuring the destruction of the environment. We will be a country that will end the outlandish investment in the war economy rather than increase it. We will be a country that engages a moral vision of love and justice and truth rather than follow the enticements of religious nationalism and a distorted, immoral vision. It's time for a rising. And our vote this year is like swearing an oath. America, you may never have fully been America to us, but we swear this oath that America will be. And that's why we call on you to join us in doing more. It is no longer whether or not the people who get elected recognize the poor and low wealth in this country. We will now do more to make them hear us. There is a rising. This is the moment that we must know our power and unleash it. This is the year. Our will to vote must override every racist, lying plan of voter suppression and every way that it tries to exist and break our spirit. This is why we are broadcasting this tonight, so that we can give you a reboost. A reboost. America may have never been America fully to all of us, but we swear this oath in every effort that we take that America will be.
We come with many names for the holy.
God,
Allah,
Great Spirit,
Brahman,
and those too sacred to voice.
Though we come called by different teachers,
Jesus, Mohammed, Buddha,
Moses, Guru Nanak, and others.
We declare in the face of systemic racism, silence is betrayal.
We affirm the voice
of each human.
that within each person
is endowed these rights and recognitions.
racism is the virus
that tears at our humanity,
Infects our systems.
and festers within the great democratic experiment
that is America.
somebody's hurting our people.
And it's gone on far too long.
and we won't be silenced anymore.
A pandemic magnifies the fissures,
created by racist capitalism,
where essential workers are really sacrificial.
And not given the essentials they need.
For the nearly 700 people who died every day.
From poverty in this country
before the virus.
We pray that we would not be comforted by
The false worship of broken systems.
but instead we would find a new way.
Create among us an economy of interdependence.
Somebody's hurting our people.
and it's gone on far too long. And
We won't
Be
Silent
anymore.
Because we love, we call on our leaders to help us to make America America, a shining city on a hill, and not a place of darkness and despair. Let love lead us. Let love guide us. Let love show us the way.
And as my grandmother used to say often, love is not a say word. Love is a do word. Help us to live lives filled with love. Amen and praise God.
Good evening, and welcome to Voting is Power Unleashed. And to friends and family in the West, good afternoon, and welcome to Voting is Power Unleashed. I'm Alvin O'Neill Jackson, Executive Director of the Mass Poor People's Assembly of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. We gather here tonight at the Pullen Memorial Baptist Church, Raleigh, North Carolina, for this Moral Monday Mass Assembly and Teach-In. And what a night we've planned for you. Settle in. Stay with us all 2 hours. You don't want to miss a moment. A big thank you to the 43 state coordinating committees, to our co-chairs, two of the most necessary and consequential moral leaders of our day, Bishop William J. Barber and the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, to the 200-plus national partners, organizations who are with us tonight, to Forward Justice and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, thank you. To directly impacted people, to artists and activists and special guests, many of them you will hear from tonight. To our team, many of them behind the scenes, we say thank you. We invited both presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, to address this assembly. Mr. Biden accepted and will address us tonight. 140 million poor and low-income people in this country living without health insurance, without fair wages, without clean water, and without the basic necessities to survive. But together, we must do more. Poor and low-income people have the power to change the political landscape of this nation. And so we have come together tonight to cry power like our lives depend on it, because they do. Information and inspiration, speaking to head and heart, praying with our feet. Thank you for joining us. And so we begin.
Okay, y'all, we gotta vote. We're living in some crazy, crazy times. There's a whole lot of crazy meanness, injustice going on out there. There's also amazing energy. We've got a lot of life and a powerful movement happening out there. But I admit it's strange. I'm grateful to be alive. There's so many people who have died. They did not make it, and it's hard to focus on our work. But it's important that we keep going and that we keep learning while we're in quarantine. And I hope you've learned about America. I have. I've learned about what works, what doesn't work, what we need to fix. But I know now more than ever, we need to vote. We need to vote. If you want justice, if you want economic revolution, you got to vote. It's not the end all to be all, but it's a start. It's the power of the ballot box. And there's a remedy for the dis-ease in America. And the beginning of treatment, healing, recovery is the vote. I always say that democracy is a moving target. And I'm telling you, you got to pin it down. You got to pin it down or watch it be lost. And there's people like John Lewis, give him a shout out, who gave us the blueprint. And we need to get it together and get our butts to the polls and vote. And if you ask who I'm voting for my mother. I'm voting for my friends. I'm voting for my neighbors. I'm voting for the environment, the children, people who are disabled, children who locked up in those cages. I could go on. But yeah, that's who I'm voting for. Who you voting for? I'll see you out there.
Hello. I am pleased to be part of this night and stand with all of you and the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, in urging all of you to be engaged, informed, and exercise your right to vote. We must vote like our lives depend on it, because they do.
Hello, I'm Bishop William J. Barber II, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, and on behalf of my co-chair, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, who also serves as director of Kairos Center at Union, and all of our team and all of you, we welcome you tonight. First, I want you to tell people, text it out, push it out, tell them to go to vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org, vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org, or text to MORAL, M-O-R-A-L, to 66539. That's MORAL, M-O-R-A-L, to 66539. Brothers and sisters, I want to thank you for joining from all over the nation, from our state coordinating committees to the hundreds of partners and the thousands times thousands who have gathered to make this event possible. This gathering represents a historic coalition that has united to shift the balance of power in this nation. We must shift the narrative, and we must build power among poor and low-wealth people and their allies, because we need a third Reconstruction in America. We need to face fully the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, ecological devastation, poverty, the war economy, militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And as you heard Reverend Dr. Alvin Jackson say, voting is indeed power unleashed. And before we talk about process, and before we talk about protections, and before we talk about platforms, I want to talk about power and why we must recognize this power and it must be organized and why this must happen. We began talking about power. There's a song entitled Nina Cried Power by Hosier, where it says, it's not the waking, it's the rising. It's not the waking, it's the rising, it's the grounding of a foot uncompromising. It's not foregoing of the lie, it's not the opening of the eyes, it's not the waking of the rising. And the suggestion of that song then says, and we can cry power. When we recognize that it is one thing to be awoke, it is one thing to wake up, and that is so important. But in a metaphorical sense, we also must get out of bed. And what it means to get out of bed, it means to challenge injustices, but it also means to exercise voting, because voting is power unleashed. When we talk about voting, we too often accept that the extremists have the power, or at least most of the power. But there are some things we need to clear up right here and right now. I want tonight to unleash us from all of the false narratives so that we can understand and have a deeper prophetic and political imagination. It's not the waking, it's the rising. We can be woke and still in bed, but when we awake and we get out of bed and we move in every possible way nonviolently that we can change the country. You can know there is a problem in our democracy and still not engage. But when you know there's a problem and you connect faith and works together, then that's power. When we rise up, that's where real power begins. So let us be clear. There's so much power available. We should never start from the perspective of depression and the depressive mentality that says we don't have power. If we weren't powerful, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to suppress the vote. When we look at the election results, sometimes you'll hear people say 70% of these people voted for this candidate, or they'll say the polls say this person is leading by such and such a margin. But the truth of the matter is that those numbers are about those who have voted in the past, or they are about metrics based on predictions. Most of the time, it's not about all who could have voted or would have voted if not for voter suppression. Past results and polls based on past elections don't consider eligible voters who have sat out for years because they did not hear anyone talking about the issues that matter to them, like poor and low wealth people. So let us start here. In the last election, 100 million people who were eligible to vote didn't vote. That's an incredible amount of untapped power in the last election. More than the number of people who voted for either presidential candidate or party in any election in U.S. history did not vote. When we talk about winning and losing, we have to qualify that we had an election where someone won the Electoral College but did not win the popular vote. This has happened at least 3 times since 1876. We also need to stipulate that in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the presidential election alone was determined by less than 100,000 votes. But in those same 3 states, 2.6 million poor and low-income people who could have voted didn't vote. We have power. Voting is power unleashed. We did a study because we wanted empirical data. We wanted to really understand what kind of power we could unleash in 2020 and beyond. So we did a study with a professor from Columbia University, and this is what it found. It found that voting is indeed power unleashed. We found that there were 63 million poor and low-income voters in 2016. Nearly 30% of the electorate, I want you to hear that now, nearly 1/3 of the electorate is poor and low wealth. And many times we don't even hear poor and low wealth discussed in our political discourse. Middle class, wealthy, but 1/3 of the electorate is poor and low wealth. Of those 29 million voted, and 34 million poor and low income people of every race, creed, and color who were eligible to vote did not vote. This is not, the study found, because they are apathetic about politics, but because our nation's politics are often apathetic about poverty and the poor. We've got to dispel the myth of the so-called red maps that show so many poor counties in this country that are controlled by extremists. Those maps don't show the poor and low-income people preferred Trump over Clinton in 2016. They don't show that. As a matter of fact, if you look at voters who earn less than $50,000 per year, a study in the New York Times said that Clinton won that demographic by more than 10 percentage points. That's not partisanism, that's history. Poor counties and states are not struggling because poor people have chosen to be represented by political extremists who do not serve them and their families. They are represented by political extremists who keep them in poverty because their power has not been organized and exercised. Our study found that in 15 states, even in the South, poor and low-income people voting at the same rate as those with higher incomes would meet or even exceed the margin of victory in the 2016 presidential election. Let me name them for you: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Arizona, Minnesota, Maine, Florida, New Mexico, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, Texas, Mississippi, and Ohio. In 13 of those states, These changes are possible even if a small percentage of poor and low-income people who didn't vote last time voted. And it's not even a majority. It's not even 40%. It's not even over 30%. If just 1 to 19%, in one place 1 to 30% of those potential voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, Arizona, Minnesota, Maine, Florida, New Mexico, North Carolina, Nevada, Georgia, and Texas were organized and vote for their agenda, they could fundamentally shift the outcomes from the governor's races to the U.S. Senate races to the presidency. But we know that if poor and low-income people are voting, if their issues and concerns around health and economic well-being are on the agenda, that will also drive other voters in their direction. And so poor and low-wealth people, they can become a pulling point for the rest of the nation. Galvanizing poor and low-income voters, 1/3 of the electorate, isn't about an act of charity. It is, in fact, what can and will save this democracy and our nation from falling into further crisis. We do not organize and speak to poor and low-income workers at the peril of this experiment called America. Now, half a century ago, Dr. King said in 1967, in our society, it's murder, psychologically and otherwise, to deprive a man of a job or an income. And we know that today, whether it's death from police brutality, COVID-19, poverty, not having PPEs, lack of health care, millions of people are crying, I can't breathe. Far too long in this nation, too many have refused to hear them. And it's time that our cries be turned into voting, because voting is power unleashed. Voter suppression, you need to know, those who engage in voter suppression, they also vote against police reform. They vote against living wages. They vote against health care. They vote against COVID stimulus. Those things that help all people. And then we must remember in 1965, as I conclude, what Dr. King told the movement at the end of the Selma to Montgomery movement. He said that every time there's a possibility for poor and white people to join together, particularly poor and low wealth black people and white people, the Southern aristocracy would deliberately sow division. He said that's what happened when the Negro and the white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society, a society of justice where none would prey upon the weakness of others. We can never forget. The division of racism is always used as a tactic to divide poor and low-income black, white, brown, and indigenous people, especially when they have the power to exercise their power. That's why at the Poor People's Campaign, we are intentional about bringing people together across all races, across all geographic lines. As they say up in Kentucky, from the hood to the holler, from Alabama to Appalachia, from Maine to Mississippi, from California to the Carolinas, from the Apache Nation in Arizona to the fast food workers in Missouri, from the Navajos to the farmers in Nevada and Oklahoma. We're bringing people together because voting is power unleashed. Look at the maps that you're going to see now. These maps show us that from Maryland to Texas, there are 193 electoral college votes. I want you to see this. 193 in just 15 states. That means that if any group can lock up these states, they only need 77 electoral college votes from the other 35 states to get to 270. But these are many of the same states with a small percentage of poor and low wealth people organized with their faith advocates and labor advocates and civil rights advocates could fundamentally change the outcome of the election. What else do we know about these same states? The same states since 2010 have passed racist voter suppression laws. You see the map? The same states that have engaged in racist voter suppression laws have caused people to get elected who, once they got elected, blocked living wages. Another map. Those same states blocked expansion of health care. So voter suppression is not just targeted at black and brown people. It's targeted at black and brown people, but ultimately it's targeted at the democracy, and it's targeted at progressive politics that could change the lives of all people. And this alone should let us know why we have to organize in a way that brings people together and shows them the racism of voter suppression is not just about black and brown people, but fundamentally about the future of our democracy. Because when they target certain people for voter suppression and they suppress the turnout, they end up pushing public policy that hurts everyone regardless of race, color, gender, or geography. Well, that's why we wanted to start here. Sure, we could have started with the platform and the plan, but first we want you to know you got power. Power. It's not the waking, it's the rising. We have power. Don't let anybody tell us we don't have power. I began by saying it. It's the rising. It's the rising because it's time for us to get our heads up and straighten out our backs. It's time for us to stop believing the hype about political races in this country. We really don't know what it would look like if everybody votes because it hadn't happened. We really don't know what it would look like if poor and low-income people would join together regardless of race and creed and color and demographics all over this country and vote their agenda. I say we see. I say since we have all this power, let's not leave it on the table. I say use it. And tonight is about learning how to use it. And tomorrow and the next 49 days are about doing it, rising up, rising together for a new day in America. Voting is power unleashed.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Barber, for that information and for that inspiration. My name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis. I'm the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I'm honored to be with you today, and I want to remind folks that to join our movement, please go to vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org, and please spread the word about this online event. Voting is power unleashed. When he was calling for the Poor People's Campaign in December of 1967, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "There is nothing wrong with a traffic law that says that you have to stop for a red light. But when a fire is raging, the fire truck goes right through that red light, and normal traffic had better get out of its way. Or when a man is bleeding to death, the ambulance goes through those red lights at top speed. There is a fire raging now for the poor of this society. They are living in tragic conditions because of the terrible economic injustices that keep them locked in. Disinherited people all over the world are bleeding to death from deep social and economic wounds. They need brigades of ambulance drivers who will have to ignore the red lights of the present system until the emergency is solved." Although Reverend Dr. King said this more than 50 years ago, these words still ring true today. In a nation that has lost nearly 200,000 of God's children to the novel coronavirus, we hear ambulances driving through red lights every day throughout this pandemic. As I speak right now, there are fires raging across California and Oregon and Washington and the western United States because of climate crisis. Too many Black people and Latino people, Native and Indigenous people, poor people are bleeding on our streets at the hands of the police, at the will of policy violence from deep social and economic wounds. And even before the pandemic, there were 140 million poor and low-income people, now millions more who have joined those locked in by economic injustice. And this is where a movement comes in. This is why we must cry power. This is how we must unleash our power, our protest power, our singing power, our knowledge power, and our voting power. Our democracy is on its deathbed. We have fewer voting rights today than we did 50 years ago, despite people dying for those rights. So we need everybody online this evening and our wider networks to sign up to be ambulance drivers. We have to run through the red lights of the lack of education and transportation. We have to run through the red lights of sexism and racism and homophobia and discrimination against the disabled and the deaf and the hard of hearing. We need to run through the red lights of closing polling places, attacking the Postal Service, racist gerrymandering, and all forms of racist voter suppression. We have to run through the red lights of poverty, of homelessness, of low wages, of unemployment and abandonment in the midst of abundance. And we have to mobilize and organize and register and educate, and we have to vote because our lives and the life of our democracy depend on it. Frederick Douglass is famous for saying, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." Well, the Poor People's Campaign has a powerful set of demands: healthcare, living wages, equitable education, immigrant rights, demilitarization of our world and our communities. And we are uniting around our moral policy agenda to heal and transform America, a Poor People's Jubilee platform. This election, millions of poor and low-income voters must vote for that agenda and keep on organizing, shifting the narrative, and building power. Right after saying power concedes nothing without a demand, Frederick Douglass continues, "It is not the light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." America, these yet to be United States, what if we are that fire, that storm, that whirlwind? What if we gathered online this evening are ready to ignite a fire of justice, a storm of truth, a whirlwind of righteousness? We, as a people, are readying ourselves to save the heart and soul of our democracy. Please sign up at vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org. We are calling all ambulance drivers. We need you now.
Tonight, we did not come to ask, but to demand. Somebody's been hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. We, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for more revival, are not going to back up, we're not going to shrink up, and we're not going to let up until we get what we deserve. So tonight, America, hear us loud and clear. We, the 140 million poor, low-income folks in this nation, we are not going to allow you to keep your knee on our neck and allow for you not to let us have the right to live. So hear us tonight. Hear the demands of the people.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America.
Everybody has a right to live.
The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has come up with a series of demands.
I know that you are here for the same reasons we all are here, to put our elected official on notice.
The pain and the discontent is real, and the demands of our movement are moral.
We know what we want to focus on. Our agenda is clear.
We demand an immediate implementation of federal and state living wage laws. We demand the right for all workers to form and join unions. We demand equal pay for equal work. We demand a guaranteed annual income. We demand fully funded anti-poverty programs that protects the welfare of us all.
We demand the expansion of Medicaid in every state. We want single-payer universal health care, not for some, but for everybody.
We demand an immediate restoration Civil Rights Act. We demand an end to racist gerrymandering.
We want early registration of 17 and 18-year-olds. We want registration to vote at age 18. If we can be drafted for war at 18, we ought to be able to vote automatically at 18. Early voting in every state, same-day registration, and the enactment of Election Day as a holiday.
We demand a reversal of state laws that prevent municipalities from raising minimum wage.
We demand an end to mass incarceration and the continuing inequalities of black, brown, and poor white people with the criminal justice system.
We demand the right to vote for the formerly incarcerated. A clear and just immigration system. This includes providing a timely citizenship process that guarantees the right to vote. The First Nation, Native American, and Alaskan Native people retain their tribal recognition as a nation, not a race.
We demand decent housing. We demand relief from crushing household, student, and consumer debt.
We demand equity in education. We demand an end to the resegregation of schools. We demand free tuition at public colleges and universities and an end to profiteering on student debt. Equitable funding for historically black colleges and universities.
We demand the repeal of the 2017 federal tax law. And we demand that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share.
We demand an end to military aggression and warmongering. We demand a stop to privatization of military budget and any increase in military spending. We demand a ban on assault rifles and a ban on the easy access of firearms. We demand an end to federal programs that send military equipment into local and state communities. We demand that the call to build a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border be ceased.
We demand a ban on fracking, mountaintop removal, coal mining, coal ash ponds, and offshore drilling. We demand a ban on all new pipelines, refineries, and coal, oil, and gas export terminals.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
Somebody's hurting my brother, somebody's hurting our sisters, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. We believe that everybody has a right to live, to live, to live, to live, to live.
We know that if the rejected millions, those of us without health insurance, without living wages, without clean water, and without voting protections, if we unite, organize, and vote together for a common agenda, we can change the political calculus in this country. We can make a nation where our demands are not just possible, but realized. And we need you. If we are going to show the power of poor and low-income people, it will require a massive organizing and outreach drive across this country. You can sign up to get involved today by becoming a more organizer. You'll be trained in how to reach out to your own community, to make sure they're registered, make sure they filled out the census, get them signed up for election reminders, and very importantly, to talk to them about the Jubilee policy platform, about the demands of this campaign, and how important this election is to getting us one step closer to making those demands realized.
So if you're ready to do more, join us at poorpeoplescampaign.org.
And to all of you that are out there, we need you to go to vote.poorpeoplescampaign.org or text MORAL, M-O-R-A-L, to 66539. Now, part of this night is to talk about the plan, and then to talk about protections, and then talk about where we move over these next days. But we also took the time to invite both candidates for president to come and to speak to the issues of poor and low-wealth people at this gathering. Vice President Biden agreed, said he would come. We've not heard from the Trump campaign, even after numerous attempts. This is a serious moment we're in, my brothers and sisters. As Liz says, let me reemphasize that we know that if the millions of potential voters were activated, who represented the 140 million poor and low-wealth people before COVID, and the additional millions now, and the millions unemployed, and the millions without health care, they could literally pull people in their directions on issues of health care and economic poverty and dealing with low income. They could call on this country to make the main concern of our policies the families and the children in every state, every county, every corner of this country that are poor and low wealth. 62 million of them work every day for less than a living wage. And don't you realize that if that happened, if we focused on poor and low wealth people and made it clear, not just as a metaphor, not racializing, moralizing to poor and low wealth people, not marginalizing them, but talking to them and laying out policy, it could fundamentally transform the democracy for everyone. It's constitutionally consistent, it's morally defensible, and most of all, it's economically sane. And so we want to welcome Vice President Biden to come for 7 to 10 minutes to talk specifically about his campaign. But I'm not going to welcome him tonight. The people in this campaign that made up this campaign, poor and low-income people, they wanted to welcome him. They wanted them to hear their voices. And so now we want you to hear from them, Vice President Biden. They wanted to welcome you to come because they represent that broad coalition that Dr. King and others have talked about that we believe in, their agency, that have power that they need to unleash. And then after you see the video and you hear them welcome you, we give you the stage.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week, still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying.
I'm 42 years old, and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I don't have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills, and they need school clothes and stuff. They be asking me for, I can't give it to them.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care and they canceled my health insurance and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. You know, if you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence and I lost a daughter.
No parent should have, in America, should have to bury their child for a lack of medicated space. I'm wailing because my children
My God.
are no more.
My God. My God, Kevin.
Well, I'm wailing, y'all. Wailing. Because my babies ain't no more. How many more babies? How many more children? No more.
Hello, my name is Wanda Bryant. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm one of the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country who are changing the narrative and building power. I would want to welcome you to address the Moral Monday Mass Assembly. Voting is power unleashed.
My name is Lakin Dillingham. I am from Lexington, Kentucky, and I am one of the 140 million poor and low-income people trying to change the narrative and build power. I want to welcome you to address this Moral Monday Mass Assembly. Voting is power unleashed.
My name is Reverend Leonina Arismendi. I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I'm one of the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country fighting to change the narrative and build power. And I want to welcome you to address our Moral Monday Mass Assembly. Voting is power unleashed.
Vice President Biden, we are glad to welcome you on behalf of thousands, literally millions of people who are part of this movement. As you can see, we are people from every walk of life, whether it be Kansas farmers or fast food workers in the Carolinas, indigenous people, Latino people, people from the Midwest, the Northwest, the Far West. We are here. And we know that even in states with the history of voter suppression, the coming together of poor and low wealth people, this segment of voters around issues could break through and could certainly even break through in the Solid South, could create a new voting bloc in this country. And they are listening to hear from you tonight. And we thank you for joining us. Following you, we will then begin to talk about our plan and have lawyers to come on and talk about our protections. But we first want to hear from you about your proposals to address the issues of poor and low wealth people. God bless you, my friend.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank you all. I understand Wanda Lakin and Reverend Leo. I want to thank you. I understand you spoke. I couldn't hear you. But Bishop, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your friendship and your fellowship. You know, Reverend Theoharis and Reverend Jackson, and to all of you joining us tonight, I'm humbled to be with you. My daughter, who is a full-time social worker, is part of your effort, and can't be here tonight because she's visiting a very sick friend who has a kidney replacement. But I just want you to, her name is Ashley, and Reverend, she's anxious to meet you. Look, together we can carry on Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. It's based on a simple moral truth, that we're all created in the image of God, and everyone's entitled to be treated with dignity and respect. My dad used to say, Joey, a job and a place in the community is a lot more than about a paycheck. It's about dignity. It's about respect. It's about being able to look your kid in the eye and say it's going to be okay. So many people today can't say that or do that. So many people have made the walk that my father had to make up a short flight of stairs back when things were going. He lost his job in Scranton, Pennsylvania years ago when I was a third grader. and said, you got to stay with your grandpop. It's going to be about a year. I'll come back every weekend. It's only 157 miles, Joey. I couldn't imagine what it was like going down asking my grandfather whether or not we could all stay there, including my mom. What a difficult thing that must have been. But look, everybody, a lot of people have been awful close. We got out of it. We lived in what is equivalent of now Section 8 housing for a while, but it took 5 years. My dad finally got us through. My generic point is everybody's felt any taste of this lack of respect, taste of this lack of opportunity, taste of being poor, taste of what it feels like, understands what you're doing, Bishop. You know, we've discussed how that moral truth animates the founding documents as you call them, the founding documents. The founding covenants is your phrase. And we're always talked about the work left undone to make real the promise of how too often our politics doesn't speak enough to the 140 million people who live in poverty, struggling paycheck to paycheck in the wealthiest nation on earth, scared to death. I can remember my dad going to sleep at night, and I could hear him just rolling back and forth in bed because he didn't have any health insurance, wondering what in God's name happens if we get sick. I thought I watched it on his face, you know. But at your forum last year, during Holy Week this past April, I promised you that we'd not only talk about it, but we'd do something about it together. And I want to be part of your movement. That's why I'm here tonight. All of you remind me of how Scripture describes a calling born out of the wilderness, a calling to serve, not to be served, a calling toward justice, healing, hope, not hate. You know, to speak the good news and followed by some good deeds. It's not just enough to speak the good news, but good deeds. You know, and here we are with the nation in the wilderness right now, a public health crisis that's killed nearly 200,000 of our loved ones, friends, neighbors, innocent souls, mostly people in the poor community who've been exposed, who have no place to hide. And that number's growing. An economic crisis that puts tens of millions of you out of work, facing eviction, living on the edge. I mean, what's going to happen when you have to pay that rent if you're lucky enough to be in a place where you have a safe place to live? Together, these crises have ripped the blinders off the systemic racism that still plagues this country and denies so many of you the ability to reach your God-given potential. You know, and the inequities that existed, they existed long before things got much worse now. But they've existed for a long time. You know, where those at the top see things going up, but those in the middle and below see things getting worse. And we have leaders who bear false witness, who want us to believe that our country isn't gone off track, just as we face historic divergence in every way of life. But what does it mean if the stock market soars as families teeter on the brink of hunger and homelessness? You all see these lines, these for food lines, people lining up just to get some bread, milk, food. Or when we must take care of one another in a crisis and those in power say, cut unemployment benefits so that those who cannot find work or work safely can't pay their bills, put food on the table, even proposing to cut the SNAP program, to fund Social Security, eliminate Obamacare in the middle of a pandemic, reopen our schools without the resources or the guidance they need to do it safely. It's estimated to cost $20 billion to open our schools safely. So we can have sanitary conditions, they can be sanitized, so we can have smaller classes, more teachers, people with masks, whether you're black, white, Latino, or Asian American, Native American. But those in power want to sow division among us. You know, that's what we don't all want to see. They say we're all different. We don't want the same things, but we do. You want a decent shot. My dad used to say, Joey, I'm not looking for a hand. I'm looking for an opportunity. I don't expect the government to solve my problems, but I expect them to at least understand it. Everyone wants a shot at a good job, good health, safety for your kids and your communities. But the folks out there now want to separate us by race, by neighborhood, by faith, so they turn against one another. Forget how strong we are when we take care of one another. When we're together, there's nothing we can't do. But we will never do that. If I'm president, that's never going to happen. We're going to talk about our obligations to one another, how we benefit when we help one another. Ending poverty will not just be an aspiration. It will be a theory of change to build a new economy that includes everyone, where we reward hard work. We care for the most vulnerable among us. We unleash the potential of all our children and protect the planet, which is the victim of global warming. And so we can live on. And where we build a country where you don't just survive, but you're able to thrive and grow. It starts by containing the virus, by providing all the PPE, the safety measures, through masking, social distancing, testing and tracing, preparing for a vaccine that's free, and any cost associated with COVID is paid for free. It's bringing people together and delivering real, immediate economic relief to those who need it most, for rentals, for food, for unemployment assistance, for those in the gig economy being able to get unemployment assistance, to those who are fortunate enough to be able to have started school but have this horrendous debt of student loans. Get small business support to folks who have great ideas and are successful as anyone else if they have a chance. To aid the schools and the state government so first responders can stay on the job. It's building an economy that eases the financial burdens of your family, that feel the squeeze of raising your kids and caring for an aged loved one. I don't know where some of these guys have ever been, what it's like to look at your kid and realize you don't have enough to get them the right clothes. I remember my dad used to say, well, look, we can't get shoes this week, but, in a month we'll have payday. You just put that cardboard in the bottom of the shoe. It means things that, it's about people's pride and dignity as well. It means a minimum $15 an hour wage, paid sick leave for everybody. Healthcare that isn't about keeping you from getting less sick. It actually helps you stay healthy. And education. Look, right now in Title I, school districts that don't have much of an income, that they don't have much of a tax base, making sure we triple the Title I funding from $15 billion a year to $45. That would allow us to pay teachers to stay in those schools. It would allow us to put school psychologists and school nurses and school social workers in the school to help these kids get through. Providing preschool free, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds going to school. Every single study shows of the last 10 years from the great universities. No matter what the background, no matter what your zip code, if a kid gets to go to school at age 3, school, not daycare, school, they have a 58% better chance of making it all the way through 12 years of school without any problems. Where low and middle income families won't spend more than 7% of their income for child care under the age of 5. Look, think of all the women you know. I was a single dad, and I had my wife and daughter were killed in an automobile accident. My 2 sons almost died in that accident. They were 3 and 4 years old. I had a great job. I was a senator making $42,000 a year, more money than I ever made before in my life. And guess what? I couldn't afford child care, but for my sister and my brother and my mother. Where there's free tuition, if you can you make it through those early years. Free tuitions at colleges and universities, qualified credentialed programs, so that the debt never again blocks a path to pursue a chosen career for you and your family. Housing that's affordable so that you can rent it, so no one ever has to pay more than 30% of whatever their income is, and there's no homelessness. You get housing, period. It should be a right as well as health care. Gives working families a fair opportunity to own their own home, so they can create a basis for generating some wealth. That's how most middle-class families made it in their homes. Give first-term home buyers a $15,000 tax credit so they can, in fact, have a down payment if that's what they're able to do. Protect you from the environmental hazards and gun violence. And end the scourge of redlining and homelessness. We can do this. It's within our power to do it. We can afford to. We cannot afford to fail to do it. Historic investments that lift up all communities so we can fill the potholes in your streets and cracks in your sidewalk, fix the street lights, install needed broadband just as your children are trying to learn from home so you have the equipment and have the computer capability to do it. Demolish the blighted properties and create safe spaces to live and work and play safely. Environmental justice so we can turn the faucet on and drink water, breathe clean air. I'm sorry, I'm about to end, but no, live. We have to live. So we have to just give people a chance. And finally, it's protecting our sacred right to vote, the great equalizer in our democracy, the reason you all are together tonight. Our late friend John Lewis, and he was a friend, said freedom is not a state, it's an act. It's an act. And he always channeled this gospel hymn that guides us today. The gospel hymn goes like this, and you've all heard it. I don't feel no way tired. I've come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me the road would be easy. I don't believe he brought me this far to leave. All of you have the freedom and the power to act, to vote. Just keep the faith, because I promise you, I'll restore the dignity for everyone, especially the poor. Every time I'd walk out of my grandpa's house up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, he used to yell, "Joey, keep the faith." And my grandmother yelled, "No, Joey, spread it." We got to spread the faith because everyone is entitled to have some dignity. I want to thank you, and I'm sorry to go over, Bishop, but I want to God bless you and all you do, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
Vice President Biden, we want to thank you, first of all, for coming on and talking policy to this large contingency of people. I want you to know there was a little tech difficulty because there were 10 people, black, white, indigenous, Latino, women, men, farmers, fast food workers, who greeted you before you came on, and they wanted you to hear their story and their voice. And we're going to ask your staff to make sure you see that. Because one of the things about this campaign, we're trying to make sure that we understand the full breadth of what we mean when we say poverty and low wealth, and why we have to address the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false narrative of religious nationalism. We also are glad that you said one thing before you leave, and that is that the language of investment. We know from our economists that $15 an hour would pump over $300 billion into the economy. We know from our public health, specialists that work with us from UCLA, from Harvard, and Drexel have told us that in addition to changing policies, if you're going to deal with COVID, you have to address the fissures caused by systemic racism and systemic poverty. And we want you to know that 140 million poor and low wealth people before poverty, and we say poor and low wealth because we look at, as you said, those who are $400 away from an economic disaster. That's 66 million white people. That's 26 million black people, even though that's 61% of all black people. It's millions of Latinos, Asians, Natives. It's us. It's us. And all of us have to rise now. Before you came on, we talked about a song, we didn't play it, and it says, it's not the waking, it's the rising. And it's time for us to indeed rise. We thank you for talking policy. We thank you for speaking directly to poor and low wealth people all over this country. There are tens and tens of reporters on from everywhere, and thousands and thousands and thousands. Last time we did this, 3 million people viewed, so I don't even know what the numbers are tonight. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and God bless you.
Reverend, we owe you big. We owe you. Keep it going. God love you.
My friends, Reverend Dr. Jackson and I are here standing together because you've heard the power that we have and the power we must unleash. You've heard one of the platforms of one of the presidential candidates, but now it's time for you to hear the plan. Now it's time for you to understand how we all engage. And it's also time for you to hear from two of the best civil rights lawyers in the world about the fight, the offensive fight that we're going to wage to protect our vote. Nobody should ever think they can mess with our votes, and we're just going to lay down and let it happen. So now we go. Tell everybody, text some more people, call them, tell them, get on. Because now every fight must have a plan, and every battle must protect the things that we use to fight with. That's where we are now in the rest of this program. God bless you.
Good evening. I'm Cheryl Eiffel, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We're so proud to be co-sponsoring this evening with the Poor People's Campaign and Forward Justice. This is an extraordinary night, an extraordinary opportunity for you to receive the training you need in voter protection for this year's election. You don't need me to tell you that this is the most consequential election of our lifetimes. I am not exaggerating when I say that, because what is at stake in this election are not just the candidates on the ballot, but democracy itself. What is on the ballot for this year's election is the ability of Black communities and brown communities and poor communities to participate equally in the political process, to be able to elect candidates of their choice, and to be able to play a real role in the destiny of their communities. I stand with Forward Justice and with the Poor People's Campaign tonight because we recognize that you need to have information in your hands to allow you to participate in this political process this year. The LDF, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was founded by Thurgood Marshall in 1940. Many people know our organization best for our extraordinary success in the United States Supreme Court, including the groundbreaking case Brown versus Board of Education, which ended legal apartheid in this country. But when Thurgood Marshall, our founder, who became the first Black Supreme Court justice, retired from the court and was asked about his most important cases, the case he mentioned was not Brown, but Smith versus Allwright, a case he won in 1944, in which he successfully argued in the Supreme Court to strike down the use of all white primaries in the South. The reason that Thurgood Marshall thought that was his most important case is because he believed the theme of tonight, that when you unleash the vote, you unleash political power. We need to unleash political power to be able to transform our communities, to be able to shore up our education system, to be able to transform wealth inequality and economic inequality, to be able to make real criminal justice reform more than just a first step, to be able to ensure that we have a meaningful voice in our destiny, in the lives of our children and our grandchildren. But this year we know we are under multiple threats. One threat is one with which I am long familiar. I became a voting rights attorney in 1988, and since then we have been fighting voter suppression in the courts. This year, however, the pressure is like never before. Since the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County versus Holder case in 2013, which released southern jurisdictions mostly, but jurisdictions around the country, from the obligation of having voting changes pre-cleared by a federal authority, we have seen voter suppression tactics explode around the country that could never have occurred before. Mass voter purges, polling place changes, voter ID laws deliberately designed to keep Black and brown people from voting, voter intimidation. We're seeing it around the country. LDF and other legal organizations are in the courts fighting, but we need to have you be our eyes and ears. We need you to be standing vigilant and to report to us when you find these discriminatory voting practices happen so that we can leap into action. We need you on Election Day to be part of our election protection team on the ground, monitoring polling places to make sure that voter suppression is not happening in real time in both early voting and on Election Day. But we also face a threat from the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic disproportionately is affecting African American and Latino communities. We want our communities to be able to vote, but we want to be able to vote safely. That means we need to protect the ability to vote absentee for those members of our community who are vulnerable to COVID-19. But we have seen around the country attacks on absentee voting. From the highest levels of office, we have seen the effort to discredit absentee voting. LDF is in courts around the South trying to relax onerous restrictions on absentee voting. And you should follow us to make sure that you know what the rules are in your state and in your jurisdiction. We'll keep fighting in the courts, but you have to do the work of ordering your absentee ballot and ensuring that you get it in on time. But that's not the only way to vote. Sure, absentee voting is important, but we want you to be able to vote in person safely as well. And that means we need early voting. And that means early voting throughout our communities in fully manned polling places. This was a problem we had in the primary election because of COVID-19. You know that a majority of poll workers are over age 60, a quarter of them over age 75. We need younger poll workers to be out in force this year so that our polling places don't have to close because they don't have people who can work in them. Tonight you'll learn how you can volunteer to be a poll worker and join LDF and other campaigns that are working to expand our poll worker capacity. It's also true that on election day, we can expect there to be long lines. We can expect there to potentially be intimidation. We can expect there to be machine malfunctions. We can expect polling place changes at the last minute. We can expect all kinds of shenanigans, both inadvertent and deliberate. And we need to have our eyes and ears on the ground. We'll be ready to go into the courtroom if necessary and to pressure local officials to ensure that every voter standing in line is able to cast a ballot. But it won't even end then. After the election, we need to ensure that every vote, including all of the absentee votes, are counted. Tonight, you're going to receive a training from some of the best in the business. And so it's important that you sit, that you prepare yourselves, that you take in the information, that you go to the websites that are recommended, and that you decide that in this election, you are going to fight for our democracy. This is what's required of this generation. Maybe you think that if you had been alive during the civil rights movement, you would have been marching on the Selma Bridge. Maybe you think you would have been part of the Freedom Rides. Maybe you think you would have been sitting at a lunch counter seeking to integrate it. But that's not the call for 2020. This is the call for 2020. And this is your call. We're giving you all the tools you need to be who you want to be at this moment in our nation's history. When your grandchildren ask, what did you do during that perilous period in 2020 when democracy was at the very brink, you will want to tell them that you were fully involved, that you were fully prepared, that you contributed, and that you helped unleash the power of the vote. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Good evening. My name is Attorney Darrell Atkinson. I'm co-director of Forward Justice, located in Durham, North Carolina, a law, policy, and strategy center that's dedicated to the advancement of racial, social, and economic justice. I'm also a proud member of the formerly incarcerated Convicted People and Families movement, which is a national network of advocacy organizations led by formerly incarcerated people that are fighting for the full restoration of our civil and human rights. One of those rights that is most precious to people in this country is the right to vote. And I'm proud to announce that in North Carolina, a 3-judge panel determined that tethering the right to vote to the payment of financial penalties, legal financial obligations, fees, and fines, the court ruled that that is unconstitutional and that it cannot stand no longer in North Carolina. I'm joined by my co-director, Caitlin Swain from Forward Justice, and we're proud to be in partnership with LDF Legal Defense Fund, as well as the Poor People's Campaign in their national moral revival that's fighting for the right to protect the right to vote in this 2020 election and beyond.
We are so glad to join you tonight from North Carolina, the state that has been the testing ground for some of the worst voter suppression tactics and greatest movement fight back in the last decade. Tonight, we want to remind everyone who's watching that the Forward Together moral movement here in North Carolina won against the brazen efforts to suppress the right to vote of African Americans and Latinx voters with surgical precision. They won in 2016 and won again this year.
Good evening. My name is Tanisha Williams, and I am an attorney and digital campaign manager with the Prepare to Vote and Voting Rights Defender projects at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute. And I'm coming to you from Maryland by way of my home state, Mississippi. You've heard from our leader, Sherilyn Ifill, about what is at stake in this cycle. Specifically, what is at stake for our democracy. We believe in the power of people to create change. So we are proud to join forces with Forward Justice and the Poor People's Campaign as part of our work to dismantle barriers to the ballot box and to ensure that hundreds of thousands of people in this movement have an opportunity to vote. And not only have an opportunity to vote, but to work with us to monitor, track, and respond to voting issues across the South and the nation.
It took a civil war and a movement to end slavery and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments to change and move this country forward. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship by birthright and established the principle of equal protection of the laws. And the 15th Amendment prohibited denial or the abridgment of a citizen's right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These constitutional guarantees and the fundamental transformation in Black power across the South and the nation was immediately met with harsh, unrelenting, and violent backlash from entrenched white supremacist opposition. Every tool of disenfranchisement, from racial terror and murder to poll tax, to literary tests, to grandfather clauses, and the disenfranchisement based on Jim Crow felony system confronted Black people seeking to live out the guarantees of our freedom under the laws of this nation. It took the power of hundreds of thousands joining together in the long civil rights movement and the birth of a new youth-led, intergenerational, multi-faith uprising to call this nation to a second Reconstruction. From Montgomery to Selma, Greensboro and Nashville, to Albany and Tuskegee, to disturb the conscience of this nation and demand voting, economic, civil, political, and social rights. On January 1965, SNCC, along with Martin Luther King and the Southern Leadership Christian Conference, led a voting rights campaign in Selma to pressure President Johnson to enact new national voting rights legislation. State troopers joined the police to stop the marchers and killed a 26-year-old peaceful protester named Jimmy Lee Jackson. In response to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, the police killing of an unarmed Black man on March 7, 1965, the leaders of that movement, of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC, Hosea Williams and John Lewis, led the march from Selma to Montgomery. The Second Reconstruction of America forced groundbreaking civil rights laws, including the powerful explosion of voting rights and the expansion that followed. The path forward was never without resistance, devastating loss, yet the strides in access to electoral justice and the resilience and brilliance of Black-led freedom movement forced a reckoning with our system of democracy, a heralding in voting power that in 2013 allowed the first Black president of the United States to speak on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We know how to do this. We've done it before. We can do it again.
2013 marked a devastating turn in the decades-long march to equal voting rights. In the Shelby County versus Holder decision, the Supreme Court gutted key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. voters in jurisdictions with the most notorious histories of voter suppression were left without vital, proactive protections to stop restrictive voting regulations from going into place before votes were lost. Immediate suppression followed. Overnight, from Texas to North Carolina, states enacted laws that had until then been held back by the more powerful Voting Rights Act aimed at shrinking the electorate and restricting the right to cast a free and fair ballot. A new wave of regressive attacks on voting rights swept the nation. These tactics of suppression took form as photo voter ID laws, voter registration restrictions, early voting rollbacks, voter roll purges, and racial gerrymandering schemes. These new restrictions build on the old tactics of voter suppression, including felony-based disenfranchisement, a tool of white supremacy that has a strategic and disproportionate impact on communities of color and people living in poverty. Voter suppression today comes in many forms, from inaccessible, intimidating, and hidden poll sites to overt acts of voter intimidation. In this year's primaries in North Carolina, white supremacist symbols surrounded an early voting site, a signal targeting Black voters, immigrants, people of color. And in primaries in Kentucky and Georgia, polling location closures resulted in hours-long lines stretching for blocks. Voters were left knocking on the doors of polling sites, demanding their right to cast a ballot. Historic and modern forms of voter suppression are now exacerbated by the ongoing pandemic. There were 140 million people living in poverty prior to this pandemic. Now, our nation faces unprecedented and interlocking crises in public health, housing, employment, and educational access, and more. While the right to vote is as important as ever, our elections have not escaped the effects of the pandemic. From poll worker shortages to battles to secure the right to vote by mail for citizens at highest risk of the virus, the pandemic creates new hurdles in our work to secure and protect the right to vote.
The battle in November will not be easy, but each and every one of us has a role to play. LDF's founder, Thurgood Marshall, said, "This is your democracy. Make it, protect it, pass it on." So here are a few things you can do to make it, protect it, and pass it. First, register to vote. Given all the tactics we're seeing, the earlier you register, the better. Then, reach out to your friends and family and make sure they're registered too. Share resources with your network and create a voter plan. Make sure you have a mask, hand sanitizer, and know your polling location. And don't forget to complete the census. Finally, volunteer with us on Election Day by monitoring polling sites. You have power and your vote matters. We know COVID-19 has presented challenges, but none that we can't overcome. Our democracy matters and your health does too. Here are a few practices for voting during COVID-19. Some states allow for online voter registration, which is the safest method to register to vote, and some allow for early in-person voting, and vote by mail is an option too. If you do decide to cast your ballot in person, grab your mask, hand sanitizer, and socially distance yourself. Voter suppression tactics have only gotten more sophisticated. Do your part to combat misinformation and counter it with accurate facts, whether on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and your networks. And when you do spot issues, let us know. Our coalition of voting rights advocates is here to work with you to identify and respond to voter suppression. This is your democracy. Protect it by becoming a poll worker. Historically, Black Americans have been most affected by hours-long waits to vote. Add in COVID-19 and there's the capacity to make it worse. Poll workers are frontline workers. They are ambassadors to our democracy and make our elections run. But there is a critical shortage. This shortage makes it harder for people of color to vote and can result in the closure of in-person polling sites. It doesn't have to be this way though. There's a movement happening right now. You marched, you chanted Black Lives Matter, and you demanded change. Now let's take it further. Sign up to become a poll worker. Go to voting www.naacpldf.org and become a poll worker. Make it, protect it, pass it on. There's so much we can do together.
The 2020 election is now. In states all across this nation, people are registering to vote. They are requesting their absentee ballots, and they are learning the new rules under COVID-19. We know that this election is one of the most important elections in our history, and that it's our responsibility to ensure that every vote counts and every voice is heard. That's why the Poor People's Campaign, NAACP, LDF, and Forward Justice have joined together to provide a joint voter protection and training program in 10 core states. In this powerful partnership, we will support the grassroots work in Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and Texas that is already leading the fight against voter suppression. We know that state by state, community by community, while we are caring for each other, taking care of families and children, that the Poor People's Campaign leadership and partners are readying yourselves for the fight ahead, to not just run, but to sprint through the finish line and not shrink back until we have insisted together that no voter's vote or voice is lost. On Election Day, we know we need thousands of witnesses, monitors, and supporters ready to assist and respond to efforts to impede the vote, both in person with personal protective equipment. And for those who need to be home safe, we will have opportunities to join the program remotely from home. Nonpartisan poll monitors are the eyes and ears at polling sites in states all across this nation. They're the first responders who see the dangers in our democracy before anyone else does. And their work will be critical to unleashing the voting power of poor and low-income voters in this movement that votes. These witnesses will assist voters who encounter problems at the polls, spot and report issues to ensure that polling places are working as they should, and identify and report early signs of trouble facing our democracy. For community action and rapid response interventions to help ensure voting rights are protected. The rules are clear for our neighbors, and that we have collected the evidence needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act under our Constitution and our rights state by state. We need you. We need you to join us in this fight.
We know we have to build a new democracy. We can fight back. We will unleash and unlock the vote. As we expand the we and we the people, we will protect one another and our democracy. We will ensure that every vote and every voice counts. With history as our guide, we know that it takes a people's movement to rise up and call for transformative change. Movements lead change. When communities unite and mobilize around a bold vision of a more equitable and just society for all people, we drive change that can impact the entire nation.
Well, you've received a wealth of information tonight. An incredible training from Forward Justice, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Poor People's Campaign. You've received the charge from Reverend Barber, who gets us all pumped up and ready to be the best citizens that we can be. Now it's your time. It's your time to use the resources that you were given. I encourage you to go to our site, voting.naacpldf.org, to get all of the information you need about how to participate. And lastly, I must implore you to participate in the census. This is about our future. We need you to fill out the census forms, and we need you to make sure everyone in your family and your friend network has done so as well. You can do it online. Go to census.gov, fill out the census, make sure that we are counted so that we will receive the representation and the resources that we need for the next decade. I'm so glad you joined us tonight, but this is only the beginning. It's time to get to work to unleash the vote. Thank you.
My mother, Viola Liuzzo, was murdered by the Ku Klux Klan for participating in the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. She was preceded in death by James Reeb, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and thousands of others who had fought the same fight. To the credit of the movement and its martyrs, the Voting Rights Act was signed in August of 1965. But that was just the beginning. There's still so much for us to do. We still have our vote, but if we don't use it, it has no power. Like our predecessors, we must organize and mobilize. Together, we can exercise our right to vote. We can make change. We must make change. Unleash the power of your vote today.
My name is Everett Ward, and I am the General President of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, and also I have the privilege to serve as Chairman of the Council of Presidents of the National Panhellenic Council. We are so honored to be a part of the Poor People's Campaign and being a part of unleashing the power of the vote. Now more than ever before, the November 3rd election is so important for all of us to be engaged, to go out and vote, because through our votes, we can make certain that all people in this nation have the power to exercise their right, to make certain that the economic conditions of this nation is enjoyed by all people in the nation, that everyone has access to quality education, and that under the law, all citizens are treated fairly. So again, we are honored to be with all of you tonight as we discuss and understand the importance of mobilizing the vote. And on November the 3rd, let us send a clear message to this nation and to the world that democracy still belongs to all people, regardless of the color of their skin, their economic conditions, or the geographical location that they may find themselves. The future of this nation depends on all of us voting on November the 3rd. So again, go vote, let your voice be heard, and let us remain a nation where all people have a part in the direction of this nation.
Hello, my name is Vanetta Cheeks Reeder. I'm the National President of the National Panhellenic Council Incorporated. I am here to encourage you and to get you excited about this upcoming election. Voting Power Unleashed is what's going to make a difference in this election. We have a lot of communities that have come together that typically aren't part of the same base, but we all have the same interests. We all have the same concerns. We know the time is now. It's going to be made difficult for us, and so we should not let that stop us from getting where we need to be. Just don't go back. Make sure you cast your vote. Every vote counts. Every vote matters. If you can do early voting, do so. If you can do mail-in voting, do so. Just make sure that you get out and vote, because your life, my life, and so many lives depend on it. Vote.
Peace to the planet. I go by the name of Lenard McKelvey, aka Charlemagne the God. I'm just taking a break from my workout to tell y'all that y'all really need to go vote on November 3rd, okay? You know, back in the day, there was a slogan that we used to throw around, and that slogan was vote or die. Let me tell you something. If you don't vote this year, you might wake up dead on November 4th. True story. You know, the main reason we need to vote is because we can't be a group of people who sit around and discuss a whole bunch of problems all the time, but don't ever have any solutions, you know? And solutions take time, right? But one thing that we know is a tried and true solution is to put people in these government positions that actually care about our interests. I can tell you right now, well, I don't need to tell you. I just need to tell you that you need to go vote on November 3rd and vote for the people who you feel have your best interests at heart, all right? November 3rd, go vote. Charlemagne the God says, peace.
This year, unlike any before us, is critical in the African American experience. We are challenging you to utilize that voice granted by the Constitution to elect your local, state, and federal leaders. We as Americans cannot allow another year to go by that our voice is not heard. Just this year, we lost two civil rights giants, namely one of our own members, Congressman John Lewis. He literally put his body in harm's way to afford each person of color in America with the right to cast his or her ballot from whomever they so desire. I implore you to go out and vote and ensure Let those around you ride with you to the polls. Please don't forget to check on your seniors to get to the polls to participate in one of the country's most critical elections in our history to date. Please go to the polls and vote. Voting is power unleashed.
To not vote is to knowingly and actively take away your own power, to take away your own voice, to take away your own contribution to this society that we share. It is also a denigration of those who went before us, who fought for this right, who died for this right. Why did they die? Because they knew that it is a power that not only would change and affect their own lives, but the lives of generations to come. It is something we simply must do, especially if we can do it. Not everyone in this country actually has the right to vote still, who is eligible to vote. And so those of us who have that right must take it up. For now, for the future, please vote.
Hey there, want to know some fun facts? The 15th Amendment was passed to give every man the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was passed to give every woman the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act was passed to prohibit any type of discrimination that would hinder a person from voting. Now ask yourself, why was there a refusal to give people the right that's naturally theirs? Because they've known that our vote matters. Why did our predecessors fight so hard for us to have the right to vote? Because they knew our vote mattered. Why should you go out and vote in this election? Because your vote matters. Make sure you're registered to vote. Vote early if possible. Request a mail-in ballot. Be updated on your mail-in ballot to make sure that your vote is counted. Arrange transportation ahead of time. Be sure to know where your polling place is and be prepared for whatever type of force that's going to try to stop you from voting this year. Did you know that in the 2016 and 2018 election, over 1 million eligible voters just in the state of Georgia did not vote? Come on, let's be adamant about our votes this year.
The motto of the United States is E pluribus unum, or out of many, one. This implies the bonds that unite our nation's many individual citizens into one people. This is of critical importance in this day and time. These bonds often take the form of moral obligations that we owe to one another as members of one community. We have witnessed and felt the regression of our Voters' Rights Act. We've seen gerrymandering and relining of our districts. We've heard the fraudulent claims of voter fraud. We've seen the outlandish displays of voter suppression and voter intimidation. The middle class, the low income, and the poor must come together and stand in solidarity and vote for a just and a right system. We must stand collectively and use the power of our vote to create a more and just and fair system that does not criminalize the poor. We must stand together and fight and vote for living wages. We must stand together and fight for health care until it becomes a right and not a privilege. We must stand and fight together for affordable housing. We must stand and fight against every voter suppression. Let us come together collectively and vote.
There's been no time in modern history where so much has been riding on one election. But most important is the future that we want to leave our kids. Things like the Green New Deal will be voted into existence. That'll create 5 million more jobs than we'll lose by transitioning away from the fossil fuel economy. The other thing is racial equality. We're talking about a greater form of justice, and more justice for one group of people means more justice for all of us. And then economic equality. Why is so much of the wealth of the nation concentrated in so few hands? These are the things we're voting for. This is why this election is so important. And that's why it's so important that we get out and not just vote, but fill out the census as well. The two most important things you could do in a democracy. There's census and voting. So get out and vote, not just for yourself, but for the kids, the young people, those that have to come behind us. What kind of world are we leaving them?
We are struggling right now. A lot of our tenants are facing evictions. A lot of our community members don't have enough money to put food on their tables. And we have community members that cannot afford to go to the hospital even when they're getting sick. We have workers that are being forced to work and are getting sick on the job. And all of this is happening throughout the country. But we have been seeing the impacts of undocumented communities. As an undocumented person, I know I won't be able to cast a vote this November 3rd. But we also know that we can organize, mobilize, and educate the vote of our community members, of our friends, and our family members. So don't forget that you're not just voting for yourself. You're voting for us, the ones that cannot vote. You're voting for children that don't have a voice yet to vote. You're voting for youth that has been asking for change but cannot cast that ballot. So please organize, mobilize, and educate the votes in your communities.
You don't want to be someone who sits out the most important election of your lifetime, do you? No. There'll be no more democracy. Okay? I mean, yeah, it's a flawed democracy, but we can't fix it if you don't vote. Vote for the candidate who we can move in the right direction, who we the people can pressure and persuade. Please vote. Make a plan and vote early. You'll feel proud of yourself.
In the report, Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans, Changing the Political Landscape, published by the Poor People's Campaign, I learned that in my state of Ohio, poor and low-income voters had the power to change the outcomes of the 2016 presidential and 2018 midterm elections. If poor voters in my state had voted at the rate of higher income voters, we would have matched or exceeded the margin of victory in both those elections. That's why it is critical that we get out and vote. The Poor People's Campaign knows that the power of poor and low-income voters has never been more potent and critical than it is now. Our efforts have proven low-income voters will mobilize and vote when their issues are addressed. Poor people are the key to holding policymakers accountable by building people power, regardless of our perceived differences, to unite our country in a more just and moral society.
My name is Sarah. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And for us, this election is, for my family and I, this election is really important. We have a mixed immigration status family. And what happens in this election could, mean the difference between our family being able to stay together or not in this country. We're not voting because we want one candidate and think that that's going to solve our problems. We're voting to end this pain that we're experiencing, the pain of evictions and deportations and electricity shutoffs and going to the doctor and worrying about how you're going to pay, or not going because you can't pay, and no time off or no job at all. This is deep pain that our people are experiencing, but we have to recognize that we're in a different place because we're not just voting as people picking the lesser of two evils. Now we're voting as organized poor people, building a world that meets our needs and fighting for that world.
Why do you vote?
Simply because it was a right that was fought for me.
Why do you vote?
To create change.
Why do you vote?
I vote because it's my civic duty.
Why do you vote?
So that way generations after me don't have to deal with the same issues that we are today.
Why do you vote?
I vote because my vote is my voice and my voice must be heard.
Why do you vote?
I haven't missed an election since I was 18.
Why do you vote?
I feel like I'm obligated to vote.
Why do you vote?
Because as black people, we need better protection.
Why do you vote?
It's my responsibility to shape the future I want to see.
Why do you vote?
I want to be a part of change.
Voting is power. Voting is a fundamental tool that can help change our future. Voting is power unleashed. Vote, vote, vote.
And so tonight, we remind you it's not the waking, it's the rising, and voting is power unleashed. I want to thank all of the state coordinating committees, Poor People's Campaign builds from the bottom up, and all of our more than 200 partners that have joined us tonight. And for this Voting is Power Unleashed, we must do more mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. I want to thank our co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, and admonish us to hear her call that we need all ambulance drivers now. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Alvin Jackson, who's been the executive director, our own modern-day Bayard Rustin, in moving us and pulling us and organizing us together. I want to thank, you heard from Attorney Sherilyn Ifill from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Caitlin Swain, and you heard from Darrell Atkinson. You heard from their team, Laurel Ashton, our national director, and Reverend Casimir Brown, our national faith director, and Laurel Ashton's our national organizing director. And we want to thank Reverend Janelle Bruce, Attorney Janelle, and Reverend Erica Williams, who made it clear that we have demands for which we will never back up from. Never back up from. And for all of those who spoke about those demands. We thank the Reverend Rob Stevens and all of the media team, Tiara Allen and the theomusicologist, to our security team that's been here all day, or making sure things were okay. The Reverend Dr. Della McKinnon, thank you. We want to thank all of the artists and the TV personalities that are now joining in because they understand that all of us together must address systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy and militarization, and this false moral narrative of religious nationalism. We must do it all together. Every staff person, every organizer, thank you. Reverend Dr. Petty for opening up this marvelous church facility, thank you. And thank the tens and tens of thousands of you who've joined in and who are saying online, I'm in. We must have a third Reconstruction in this nation. It must happen. God help us if it doesn't. For the numbers you've heard, about 140 million poor and low-wealth people know that they have exacerbated during COVID. 30-some million people on unemployment and more have applied. 50-some million people facing evictions, another 27 million people on top of the 87 million who are already underinsured and underinsured. We cannot fully address this pandemic without addressing the pandemic of systemic racism and systemic poverty. We must hear it's not the waking, it's the rising. We must understand that voting is power unleashed. In our recent report, I remind you on unleashing the power of poor and low-income Americans, it shows that if just 34 million of the 63 million poor and low-income voters, if just 34 million would vote, that's another 5 million on top of the 29 million that voted last time because 34 million didn't vote. If they would just show up at the same rate as higher income voters, we could fundamentally change election outcomes all over this country, and especially in 16 states where the margin needed is only between 1% and 19%. The Solid South and the plans of the Solid South could be torn apart. The South and the Southwest could be unleashed. No longer would 193 votes, electoral college votes, be predetermined. Voting is power unleashed. We must be counted in the census, and we must be counted in the ballots. Now, we are nonpartisan. That's why we invited both presidential candidates. That's why you haven't heard us endorsing about it. You've heard us endorse issues. We're nonpartisan, but we are not non-political. We mobilize, and we are a movement that votes. We vote our power. We vote our issues. And we vote to serve notice that we will not disengage after the election, but we will stay engaged. I cannot say it enough. 34 million poor and low wealth people didn't vote in the last election. There's 63 million poor and low wealth people, 64 million that are eligible. Nearly 100 million people didn't vote in the last election. I understand. Some because of voter suppression, some because of transportation and can't get off work, some because you never hear poor and low wealth issues being talked about. But this movement is saying, let's move from not being heard or not hearing politicians talk about it to voting in a way that makes them have to deal with it and have to deal with the issues impacting poor and low-income people from Alabama to Appalachia, from California to the Carolinas. And so we are rising. We are rising because we have power. We refuse to be depressed. We refuse to be diminished. We refuse to be deterred. We will be deliberate because we know voting is power unleashed. And we are working to unleash that power in this American democracy for the saving of the soul of this democracy. Even if COVID had not happened, poor and low wealth people would still be voting and insisting to be heard. Too long we've not heard the issues of poor and low wealth people front and center in this democracy. That day is over. And so we've chanted forward together, not one step back. We've chanted somebody's hurting my brother, my sister, and it's gone on far too long. We've chanted Black Lives Matter and more. We've chanted that we need a sunrise and a green economy. Now it's time for all of us to come together, both for now and for the future, because voting is power unleashed. You all know out there that I've been a pastor now for nearly 30-some years. And there's no way I would stand in the pulpit tonight and not say something from the touchstone, which is the Bible, for me. I think now, Reverend Jackson, about how when Moses was facing the Red Sea in front of him and the pandemic of evil behind him in the person of Pharaoh and his army. Mountains on one side, water, a desert on the other side, water in front, enemy behind. It looked like they were pinned in. And God asked Moses one question: what's in your hand? A rod. Use it. And watch the sea part. And watch transformation come. The Spirit today is saying to us, what's in your hands? The power to vote has been dipped in the blood of the martyrs. Voting is power unleashed. We must use it. But not only that, my rabbi brothers and sisters tell me that in the Hebrew language, the same word for vote is the same word for voice. I've heard my dear sister, Reverend Tracy Blackman, talk about this. Call is the word. It means to vote. It means voice. Voice and vote are the same word. Over and over again in the Bible, in the Old Testament, whenever it says, and the voice of God, thunder, it's the word call. It could be, and the vote of God. God voted to say something about injustice. Whenever the people move, and they move in the voice of God, is also moving, they're voting their deep moral standards and their deep moral commitments. And in one text in 2 Samuel, in Acts 22, it actually says that when the voice of God moved, that it thundered and shook the land. I want to suggest that if my vote is my voice and my vote is my vote is my voice and my voice is my vote, there ought to be some thunder at the ballot box. There ought to be some shaking. There ought to be so much voting that this nation knows that we're not settling for anything less than justice for all. We're not settling for anything less than providing for the common defense of all and the promises of this democracy for all and equal protection under the law for all and domestic tranquility for all. We're not selling for anything less than promoting the general welfare for all. We're sick of all this death. Sick of it. We're sick of the loud noises of death, the deaths of police brutality, the deaths of people, workers, low-income, essential workers dying because they didn't have protection. The deaths, people are dying because of the lack of health care. The deaths of poverty. It's time for our voice and our vote to sound like thunder and shake the very foundations of this nation. Declare we cannot accept it anymore. America, death is not an option anymore. You've got to turn, because if you don't turn, you die. And then lastly, the faith book that I read says something real clear. You can pray all day long. You can shout all day long, and I do both, and do them well. You can run, you can dance. You can have services, religious and otherwise. You can believe in the possibilities of this democracy. But faith without works, Liz, is dead. Faith without works is dead. But the contrast, the other side is true too. Then faith with works is power. If we ever needed to vote, we sure do need to vote now. If we ever needed to put our faith and our works together, we sure do need to do it now. And let our foreparents not do more with us. They did a whole lot with less than we have. And let them not do more with less. We must do more with more. I think about that shero named Harriet Tubman. My God. They say that she got some 700 folk out of slavery. They say that Harriet Tubman had epilepsy, but she got some 700 folk out of slavery. They say she had a bounty on her head, but she got 700 people out of slavery. What did she have? She had moss on the north side of a tree. She had a North Star guiding her. Sometimes she carried a pistol and she told folk, you're going to be free one way or the other. Either free in heaven or free in the promised land of the North and of Canada, but you're not going back to slavery. And she had a made-up mind, and she put faith and works together. But think about what she didn't have. She didn't have Twitter. She didn't have email. She didn't have Facebook. She didn't have a car. She didn't have money. She didn't have a poor people's campaign. She didn't have all of the other things that we have. She did more with less. And let us make sure that we don't do less with more. Voting is power unleashed. And the only way we can honor our ancestors is to do more now for the cause of justice and freedom. She didn't even have the right to vote, but she fought for that right. And not only did she fight for black liberation, she fought for the liberation of women in the women's suffrage movement. And so must we come together. Across every race, every creed, every color, every kind, every geography, and every sexuality. It's time now. It's not the waking, it's the rising. Voting is power unleashed. And I, for one, want to see what a fully engaged democracy would look like. I, for one, want to see what the promises of this democracy would look like if all of us engage it and refuse to let it go and refuse to give up on it. I, for one, want to see what it would look like if the power of our vote is fully unleashed. Let's see. I believe we'll shout. I believe we'll see more justice than we've ever seen. I believe that we'll see a third Reconstruction. But it's on us now. Voting, everybody, black people, white people, brown people, Asian people, Native people, everybody, it's time now, and especially poor and low wealth people, to unleash the power. Because voting is power unleashed. We vote now, and after we vote, we remind people that we voted, and we push policies. But our first step has to be unleashing the power of our votes. God bless you. Thank you. Let's fight together. Let's fight for what's right. Forward together, not one step back. Somebody's hurting our brothers and sisters. It's gone on far too long. We won't be silent. We won't be voteless anymore. God bless you. I'll see you on the nonviolent battlefield.
Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on. I tell you, it's gone on. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. Oh, somebody's hurting my sister, and it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. Don't you know somebody's hurting my brother, and he's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore.